All right, so let's begin our lectures. So this is the first lecture. Let me check if everything is working. All right, so I'm recording this immediately after the introduction because I'm so excited to begin these lectures. It's the first lecture on Introduction in Metaphysics. I will give a general overview of everything that we will be talking about. So what we are going to talk about is metaphysics, and metaphysics is classically put in one of the main departments of philosophy. So usually we divide philosophy into 7 departments. One is logic. The other one is metaphysics. We have epistemology, ethics, and metaphysics itself is divided into general metaphysics, which we call ontology, and then the application of general metaphysics or ontology into specific domains of psychology when we're talking about humans, when we talk about ourselves, cosmology when we talk about the world outside of us, and then theology when we're talking about the ontology of the divine. So in this course, we will look into general ontology, general metaphysics or ontology, but there will be parts where we also focus on humans and psychology. So there are a couple of books that I recommend. So these are great books. These are, as you can see, I read almost all the books that Lowe has written. He has a couple of books on John Locke, but I didn't follow those. These ones are great. Definitely, I recommend that you can read them. So there's the subjects of experience. That's his psychology. Lowe is a substance dualist. We will talk about that later. Is a non-Cartesian substance dualism. The book, The Possibility of Metaphysics, that's also a great introduction to the whole concept of metaphysics and how it is possible. An introduction to philosophy of mind. Again, the name suggests, Introduction to Philosophy of Mind. A survey of metaphysics. The 4-category ontology, that's the general map of metaphysics that we will be using. In our lectures, we have personal agency, again, part of the psychology, and how when we get to humans, we will talk about the problem of free will and the metaphysics of it. There we will use personal agency. More Kinds of Being, that's also a great book. It's a kind of new version of an older book which was called Kinds of Being. You can't find that one, but this one you can find it, More Kinds of Being. We have a little bit more abstract book in Forms of Thought, where he talks about logic in a more general sense. Then we have Powers from George Muller. Now, if you read Lowe, you will see, you will realize the way that he talks and the way he writes. And it's a very clear and very, very simple way of explaining very complicated topics. And when you read Powers from George Muller, you can clearly see the influence of Muller on Lowe. George Muller only wrote one book, as far as I know, and that's Powers, but it's a great book. That's why I put it here. We have The Open Universe by Karl Popper, where when we talk about the metaphysics of free will, we can use that book. We will use that book. And then we also have Persons and Bodies by Lynn Baker, again on the topic of substance dualism. So these are the books that I love. You can read from cover to cover. I love it. But there are also other books that you can just consult. There's Mental Causation Ontology by Sophie Gibb, who I believe was a former student of Lowe. There's Soul, Body, and Survival, Ontology, Modality, and the Mind. On Action, which we will talk about, Philosophy of Action and Metaphysics of Free Will. We have The Classic Parts by Peter Simons. That's a good book because we will get also into Mariology, and we will use that book. From ontological point of view of John Heil, you can again see the influence of John Heil on these metaphysicians that we will be reading from. So John Heil is someone who, from his perspective, he's someone who takes ontology seriously, and this is also a great book to get familiar with his viewpoint. Persons and Causes, the Metaphysics of Free Will. We will get to that, the Metaphysics of Free Will. The Mind in Nature by C.V. Martin. C.V. Martin also has done very influential work in metaphysics, and The Mind in Nature is one of his classics. Then we have Individuals of Strawson, whom Lowe also referenced to many times. We have Thinking About Free Will, of course, from Peter van den Wagen. You cannot talk about free will without mentioning his work. We have Events and Their Names. When we talk about the metaphysics of free will, we will be using event causation, fact causation, and we need to know something about the metaphysics of events, which we will be used from this book, Jonathan Bennett. You can read more. We have The Self and Its Brain from Karl Popper. I haven't read this one. I know about the content generally, but I haven't read it completely. And also The Apple World is the same thing. I haven't. I read parts of it. I didn't really enjoy it, but I just put it here as a reference. Then we've got Actions, Reasons, and Causes by Donald Davidson. Of course, if you want to talk about the metaphysics of free will and causation and these sort of things, that we also need to include Donald Davidson. Then, of course, there are papers that you can find, again, from Lowe, from Kripke on these kind of metaphysical issues. All right, so now I have two goals in these lectures. Let me check if everything is working, because I did record this once and then halfway through I realized that the microphone is not recording. So I have two goals for this course. One is just to show you how metaphysics work, how we do metaphysics. And the other one is to propose an ontological framework. And the framework would be the framework of Jonathan Lowe. I wouldn't go that deep into like defending that specific framework. That's something that Lowe has done in his books, so I'm not going to repeat everything. But I will try to cover as much as possible. But the point is just to make you familiar with the way that metaphysics works, the way that I believe we should think about metaphysical issues. And I've been influenced by the way that E J Lowe thinks about these things. I before reading Lowe, I didn't know that kind of clarity is even possible in metaphysics. But again, in his books, he actually shows why metaphysics is possible in that sense. So that's the first question. Is metaphysics actually possible? So what is exactly metaphysics? Metaphysics is when we think about the structure of reality, about the kinds of things that exist. So the question is, can we learn everything just by thinking about the world? So there's this division that we have, a priori and a posteriori, which basically means a priori means only based on theoretical deduction. A posteriori means based on the observation and the empirical data that we can get from the world. And now the question is it possible to get an understanding of the world around us by thinking about these concepts, these kind of metaphysical concepts? And this is the way that we have this general sketch difference between metaphysics and empirical science. Now, metaphysics is a kind of a priori science which sketches possible ontological structures of our world. And empirical science determines the actual ontological structure of our world. So when we do metaphysics, that's why it's called metaphysics. It's not about the actual physics that's going on in the world right now. Rather, we are thinking in a kind of more general term about the possible ontological structures that we can have. And if you think about it in that way, then the question is, do we need metaphysics? I mean, if that question comes up, then we can quickly see, and it will become clear as we go through these lectures, that it's impossible not to have a metaphysics. Some people think that metaphysics is something that you could do, but you could also not do. But as we will see, it's actually impossible not to have metaphysics, because everything that we do will have some presumptions on the metaphysical structure that we are assigning to the real world. So even if you do empirical science and you're saying, okay, I haven't done anything on metaphysics, I don't know that doesn't mean that you don't have a metaphysics. That just means that you have a metaphysics that you haven't examined. You're just carrying the metaphysics that's just, the normal, typical metaphysics, or, the status quo of whatever institute you're doing your research in. So in these kind of framework, we can see that it's basically impossible to know what actually is without knowing what could be. So that's the general way that we try to explain. The metaphysics is about the possibility, and empirical science about the actual thing that exists. And it's not possible to know what actually exists based on the data unless you know what could exist. And that's something that we will look into metaphysics. So metaphysics is the study of fundamental structure of reality, and the question that we're trying to ask is what kinds of things exist. We're trying to categorize everything that exists into different categories and try to understand what kinds of things exist. For instance, humans, do they exist? Well, that's a little bit easy, but yes, we exist, right? Dogs, do they exist? Is that a kind of thing that exists in the world? Well, yes. Tables, are tables things that exist in the world? And now you can start seeing that there can be some kind of tension around here. Do tables exist? Does a statue exist? Do we have such a thing as red? We do have the color red, right? But what is it? Can we say that red exists, or is it only the red things that exist? Crying, is that something that exists? Number 4, is that something that exists? And as you can see, I'm putting question marks because it gets more and more tricky to answer these questions. But these are all metaphysical questions that we can ask, like laws of nature. Do we have such a thing as laws of nature? Is that really something out there in the universe as laws of nature? Or dispositions, when we say that common salt, for instance, has this kind of disposition to be solved in water. Do we have such a thing? God, that's a theological question. Does that kind of thing exist in our world? So these are all different topics that we can talk about in metaphysics, that we can ask, okay, so we have a world out there and something exists. Everyone can agree with that. And here is why there is impossible not to have a metaphysics, because as parts of this system that we exist, we are interacting with the world. And if you ask yourself, of course, everyone would agree that something exists, right? If anyone wants to object to this proposal that something exists, that we can easily ignore him, because if nothing exists, that even his objection doesn't exist. We all agree that something exists. But the question is, what is it exactly that exists? How many exist? So these sort of questions, this is exactly what metaphysics is all about, that we see something exists and we are just curious to know what kind of thing is it, and based on that, for instance, how many things exist, what kinds of things exist, and so on. In addition to that, what kinds of relations hold between these different entities, and which ones are fundamental and which ones are built on top of the other ones. Which ones are independent, they can stand on their own, which ones are dependent on other things. So these are the things that we study in metaphysics. Now, as we said, so we want to try to basically look at the world and then try to categorize everything that we see. And one of the basic divisions that we usually do in metaphysics is between particular and universal. So again, at this moment, I'm not defending anything. I'm not saying that these things exist. I'm just trying to define my terms, just to define what I mean by these things. And as we move forward, automatically we will see a kind of defense of these different topics. So one of the divisions that this usually happens in metaphysics, we say that there are some things that are particular things and there are some that are universal. For instance, you and I, we are particular things. All dogs that exist in the world, they are particular dogs. But cat, the kind cat, they call it a universal. Redness, we usually put it in the universal. This table, this equation, these are particulars. But humans, human beings, or being honest, these are the sort of things that we call universal. You can immediately see why we call one of them particular, the other one universal. Particulars are, well, particulars, this thing or that thing. But universals are universal. It's not a particular cat, we're just talking about cats in general, in the kind of cats. Or redness, we're not talking about this redness or this red thing or that red thing. We're just talking about redness or being honest. Of course, each one of them can also be divided into abstract versus concrete. I wouldn't go into details right now of trying to distinguish between them, but again, generally by concrete we mean things that exist in space and time. Like, I'm a concrete thing. I'm just here in space and time. I'm here. But number 4, where is it? The number 4 is an abstract concept. It's something that we think about it mentally. It's not a concrete entity in the world that we're living in. It's an abstract thing. So particulars and universals, they can be abstract or concrete. In the most general form, of course, for instance, thinking about a concrete universal is a little bit difficult, but so the definitions that we will use for universals and particulars are that the universals are those which have instances. So when we talk about cats or we talk about human beings, we can have different instances. We can have an instance of this cat. We can have this cat as an instance of cats. We can have this human as an instance of human. But particulars are those which do not have instance. For instance, you and I, we don't have instances. There's not like a couple of you. One instance of you, another instance of you. So I might say, okay, you have one instance of you. So that's also a kind of definition that a particular is like universal, but only has one instance and only one. Like, I am the only instance of myself, but that's not, I don't think it's the best way to describe them. It makes much more sense to say that universals are those which have instances and particulars are those which do not have instances. There can be interesting questions that starts to shape the metaphysical view that we have. For instance, could there be a universal without any possible instance? If we say we have a cat as a universal, but there are no such a thing as a particular cat, then does cat exist as a universal without any instance? Or could there be a particular that is not an instance? Can we have something that is not an instance of something? These are the questions that we can ask and we can answer, and that will kind of shape the metaphysical view that we will have. The ontological status of universals, some people believe that they don't exist. Universals, there's no such a thing. Like, there's no universal existing in the world, and that's nominalism. So again, we always have to go back. At least I usually go back to this, so I wouldn't get lost. We're trying to understand what kinds of things exist in the world, and so the question is universals one of the things that exist? And nominalism says, no, it's not something that exists out in the world. It's just something that we are making up based on the similarities that we see, and that's it. There's no such a thing outside as universals. There's, of course, the the Plato's thought about universals, a kind of realism, Platonic realism, that universals actually exist and they're actually more real even than the instances that they have. Because in Plato's idea, the universal of, for instance, being a human or being honest, that universal is even more real in a sense that every instance of that thing is a kind of a fallen version of that actual thing. And we also have the immanent realism of Aristotle, which says that universals exist, but they don't exist in a kind of Platonic form. Rather, they are particularized. So, and that's the view that we will have, in a sense that, so when we have different cats, the only reason that we say that there is such a thing as cat is because we have these different cats. So if there is no instance of cat, then there is no universal cat. And that's the immanent realism. So that's the answer to that question that we had. That can there be a universal without any instance? In immanent realism, the answer is no. In Platonic realism, the answer is yes. In nominalism, again, no, because just there's no such a thing as a universal. Another division that we can make in things that exist is between substantial and accidental, or substantial and non-substantial, because if you go into details, there might be a different. Accidental is a kind of a classical term that's been used. It's not exactly the same as non-substantial, but I wouldn't get into those details. Just keep it simple. Substantial and non-substantial, we just call it accidental. What do we mean by that? First, I will give examples, again, similar to particular universal, and then I will give a little bit more content to these definitions. So substantial would be this specific chair, and accidental would be its redness. Substantial would be Gandalf, and accidental would be his gaze. Substantial would be ice. Accidental would be its transparency. Substantial would be bear, and accidental would be being a carnivore. So the definitions that we will use, if you look at these different types of categories that we're trying to distinguish, accidentals are things that are born, that are put on other things. And substantials are not like that. So for instance, redness, there are things that are red. This chair is red. A gaze or a laugh, a cry is something that we don't see it on its own. We never see crying on its own. We only see things that cry. We don't see transparency out there. We only see things that are transparent. Or we don't see being carnivore out there. We just see things that are carnivores. So those things that can have these accidentals, we call them substantial. And the things that basically go on top of those things, we call them accidental. So accidentals are born, and we call them properties, or we can call them mode. But substantials are not. And now, with these two divisions, we can have four combinations. And the four category ontology is born out of this. We can have substantial universal, substantial particular, accidental universal, and accidental particular. Now these are the four divisions. We can give them different names. The first one, the substantial universals. So these are, we're talking about the kinds of things whose instance are those things that can stand on their own. We call them kind or sorts. For instance, salt, animal, humans, bear. These are kinds or sorts of things. These are substantial universals. Substantial particulars, so the instances of these substantial universals, they are what we call objects. So you, Gandalf, of the set with the number 0 in it. These are different objects that we can have. Of course, all of them, again, they can be abstract or concrete. Then we have accidental universals. We will call them properties or relations. For instance, crying. That's an accidental universal. Or being larger. That's a relationship between two things, but it's an accidental universal. It's something that two things can have with respect to each other. And accidental particulars, so crying in general is, or talking, let's say, is an accidental universal. But right now what I'm doing, this is a particular talking. So this particular talking is a particular instance of that universal talking. And we call this a mode or a trope or an accident. So for instance, the attention that you're giving me right now, that's an accident. And that's a trope, or that's a mode. Trope is a kind of modern version of accidents. So this is basically the 4-category ontology. And the way that we put them is in this kind of rectangle that we have here. And the claim that we have, and this is the 4-category ontology of E J Lowe, the claim is that these 4 are necessary and sufficient for our ontology. They're necessary in the sense that if you say that one of these 4 doesn't exist, if you're a nominalist and you say, well, that thing doesn't exist or the other thing doesn't exist, then you will lose something. There's something in our existence, there's something in our reality that you wouldn't be able to explain if you don't have one of these things. So they are necessary. These 4 are necessary, but they're also sufficient. It says that once you have them, it seems that we can explain everything. So again, we put them in this kind of box. We have kinds, properties, so the top part are the universals, the bottom are particulars, and then we have objects and modes. And there are these 4 relations that are between these 4 category ontologies. I have a call. One moment. Okay, so let's continue. I was interrupted. So we have the 4 kinds. We have the universals on top. We have the particulars on the bottom. And they're related by 4 relations. So we have the instantiation relation, which holds between kind and object and between properties and modes. As we said, that's by definition, that's the definition of universals, that they have instances. So there are an instantiation relation between object and kind. So an object is an instance of a kind. A mode is an instance of a property or a relation. And then we also have a characterization relation. So a kind is characterized by its properties and an object is characterized by its modes. So as an example, I am a human. What we are saying here is that I, as an object, I'm a substantial particular, I'm an object. When I say I am a human is a kind, which is a substantial universal. And when I say I'm a human, I am explaining the instantiation relation that exists between me and the kind human being. I'm saying that I am an instance of the kind human being. And when we say that humans are intelligent, we are characterizing the kind human by a property which we call intelligent. When we say that I am talking, I, as a substantial particular, I am being characterized by a mode or a trope, and that's the talking that I'm doing right now, this particular talking. And when I say that my talking, which is a trope and a mode that I have, is an instance of talking. So there's an instantiation relation between the talking, the property of talking, that you could have, anyone else could have, but I am right now an instance. I have the mode of talking, which is an instance of the property talking in general. When I say that I am older than you, again, I as an object, older, which is a mode, it's an accidental, is a particular accidental. We're not talking about the universal being older, that also exists. But when I say that I am older than you, it means that between you as a particular and me as a particular, there is a particular relation of being older. And my being older, this particular relation that exists between me and you, is an instance of being older, which is a universal or a relation in general. There is another relation. So after these fours and these two relations, there's another very interesting relation that exists between them. But before that, we have to go into what's known as dispositional and occurrent propositions. We have two types of propositions, and again, you can see the difference by when I give you the examples. So look at these two different types of propositions that we can talk about. One is when we say this salt crystal, you have a particular salt in your hand, you say this salt crystal dissolves in water. Versus when you say this salt crystal is dissolving in water. This object moves on a straight line. This object is moving on a straight line. These electrons attract protons. These electrons are attracting protons. The first ones, which we usually use with kind of present tense, and we say, okay, this salt crystal dissolves in water. This is what we call a dispositional proposition. But when you use a continuous form, this salt crystal is dissolving, we're talking about an occurrence, something that is occurring right now. It's happening right now. But when we say this object moves on a straight line, we're not talking about something that happens right now. We're talking about a disposition that object has. When we say that these electrons are they attract protons, we don't mean that they're attracting right now. We're just saying that they're disposed to attract protons. But when we say that these are attracting protons, we're saying that's happening right now. So this is a division that we do between dispositional and occurrent. And the question is basically, why is it that they can be true? Of course, we use these sort of sentences, right? So we might say, okay, common salt dissolves in water, or is water soluble. Or you might pour some salt in the water and then you say, okay, this salt is dissolving. Why are they true? Now, the occurrent one, well, we just saw that it was dissolving in water, right? So if you have an occurrent one, you say, okay, this salt is dissolving in water, and you're asking, okay, why is it that it is true? Then you can't say, okay, well, I just saw it that it is dissolving, I'm looking at it right now. But the question is the dispositional one. That's a trickier one. When we say that this salt crystal dissolves in water, why is that true? You might say that if we put it in water, it will be dissolving. But how do we know that's true? Or if you say that this is a salt crystal and salt dissolves in water, that might be something that we claim. Now, I wouldn't go into details of exactly what the problem is with these things. We will have a lecture specifically to go through them. But I'm just talking about different reasons that we might come up with, right? We might say, okay, well, I just saw that it was dissolving in water. If we put it in water, it will be dissolving. That's why we say that this specific salt crystal dissolves in water. Or we might say that this is a salt crystal and salt dissolves in water. So different ways of reasoning that we might have. Now, if we use this four-category ontology, trying to break down and decompose what we are saying here, we have to realize that we have four entities involved here in the occurrent and also dispositional. We first have this salt crystal, which is a particular substance, an object. We have salt, which is the kind salt. We have the property of water solubility. So it's when we say that it dissolves in water, we basically mean that it's water soluble. It's a property. And we also have this specific dissolving in water. So we have all four kinds in occurrence and dispositional propositions. Now, there are two ways that we can connect an object to a property. So if you look at this rectangle, this box that we have, the four category, there are two ways that we can connect an object to a property. One is to say that this object, this salt, is an instance of the universal kind salt, and salt is characterized by water solubility, or by being soluble in water, right? The other way that we can connect object to a property in this kind of diagonal way is to say that this specific salt is characterized by the mode or by the trope of dissolving in water, and dissolving in water is an instance of being dissolved in water as a property or water solubility. So the interesting part is that if we write these two directions, one going from object to the kind and from kind to property, and from object to the mode and from the mode to property, they're exactly the dispositional versus occurrent way of talking about the relation between the object and property. So when we say that this specific salt is water soluble or dissolves in water, what we actually mean is that this salt is an instance of salt, of the kind salt, and salt is water soluble. But when we say that this salt is dissolving in water, what we mean is that this salt right now has the mode of dissolving in water, and dissolving in water is an instant of water solubility. So if we want to include also this dispositional versus occurrent way of thinking and talking about different objects, the relation between object and property, we also need to add a new a diagonal relation, which we will call exemplification. So exemplification means that an object can exemplify a property, but it can do it in two ways. It can do it in a kind of substantial way. That's when you go from object to kind, from kind to property, or you can do it in an accidental way, from object to mode, from mode to property. And the interesting part is that each one of these paths will correspond to a dispositional or a current proposition. If we go substantial, we go object to kind, kind to property, we're talking about dispositions. When we go from object to mode, from mode to property, we're talking about accidental. So again, as we said, if you say that this dispositional is that this salt is an instance of kind, that's instantiated by that. And then this salt is characterized by property and relations. This is the dispositional exemplification, right? So we have dispositional exemplification and we have the accidental exemplification. One of the bridges that we have in the dispositional exemplification, where we go from kind to property, that's something that we call the natural law. Again, I'm just giving a very general overview, defining my terms. Things will become much more clear when we go into details. But I'm putting everything on this box. So when we have the exemplification, we have one part where a kind is connected to a property, and we are claiming that when we talk about natural law, what we mean, we are expressing that characterization of a kind by property. So for instance, when we say protons attract electrons, you see that's a kind property. Or when we say that salt is water soluble, that's a kind property. Or when we say that this object moves on a straight line, that's a kind to property. And if each one of these things, if those protons or that common salt or those kind of objects, if they have instances, then the second line will add, that's the instantiation from kind to object, and then we will have an exemplification in that object of that specific property. So if we have an electron, then we will have a disposition in that electron to attract protons. If we have an instance of a common salt, we would have a disposition in the common salt to dissolve in water. And if you have an instance of those sort of objects, then there's a disposition in that object to move in a straight line. So the top line is what we call the natural law, and the bottom line is what we call the empirical data, because that's the object that has a trope or a mode, and we're observing that. That's something that's happening right now. And that's why in the occurrence ones, we go from the bottom. And those are the empirical data that we have. So again, we will talk more about this, but we never observe dispositions. We never observe natural laws. And that's one of the reasons that people sometimes deny that there is such a thing as a natural law, as we will get into. Empirical data is all about what's occurring right now. And that's the link that exists between object and mode. So when we observe something, you're observing me talking. That's a characterization of this particular by this particular mode. Now, the particular mode that I have is an instance of an accidental universal. So in a sense, I am exemplifying the property of talking, but in an accidental way. So you can say that he is talking. So as I said, the claim is that this structure that we have here, this is necessary and sufficient. If we remove any of these four categories, what would happen is that we will be missing one of these links. So we expect that there is something that we won't be able to explain. Either you cannot explain dispositions or occurrences or empirical data or natural law. There is something that you will be missing. So in the next lectures, we will go through them in more details. We will look into different examples, and we will see how different metaphysical positions will fail to explain one of the links that we have here. And as we go through them, it will become much more clear why this four-category ontology is so powerful, and it will give you a very interesting structure that you can look through the world and then put everything into this category, and things will become much more clear. So I hope that's clear, but if it's not, you can ask your questions in the comments, and I will try to answer them. Cheers.